Okay, we're going to take a look again at the chapters from Genesis 4 onwards to 11. This is the second installment of that little analysis. We're going to talk about the story of Cain, Abel, and Seth up to, I hope, chapter 6 of Genesis. Okay, let's begin without further ado. Let's do that. Okay, here we have the text of the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, on the left. Then the German Standard Bible, and of course the Hebrew text, just in case there is something to explain about the translation. We have in Genesis 4 to 6 two lines of descent, and they disclose two opposite trends in human race, in humanity. We have the line of Cain, a downward plunge of humanity in sin and wickedness. Against this line of Cain, we have the godly line of Seth. Now, what is the author of Genesis trying to explain to us? Well, it's trying to lead up to the passage, the narrative of the flood. And just before that, we have Genesis 6, verse 5. Let's look it up. Genesis 6, verse 5. And this is the result of the previous generations. The line of Cain is triumphant over the line of Seth. And the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. But, in verse 8, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And there are generations of Noah. That is to say, there is a history. There are Toledot of Noah. Something comes out of Noah. And it's obvious now that God, after the flood, made a new beginning. Recreated humanity with Noah as its first father, just like Adam was the first father of all of mankind. But take a look at this, verse 5. The wickedness of man was great, every imagination of the thoughts of his heart. So now evil has become something internal. We found that Cain is tempted by his inner inability to accept his brother as someone that he needs to take care of. We found that Eve was tempted into thinking that she could be completely independent in her life. And here we have a society, a world, where the whole of humanity is so under the influence of sin that you can hardly escape it. And that's why verse 8 is so special. There are still here and there people that are the exception. But that's not enough. Ultimately, the generations of Noah, the children, grandchildren of Noah would succumb to the force of this line of Cain, this part of humanity that is totally evil. So here in Genesis 6, we have the announcement of a complete reversal of creation, and then Noah as the exception to that. But let's go back to chapter 4 to figure out what exactly this line of Cain means. We talked about the first elements here, the different modes of life that they have. Cain and Abel are totally different people. One tills the ground and the other keeps sheep. And then in the worship, they have two different offerings. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. So ein Opfer von den Früchten der Erde. That's what Cain does. Now, what is the reason that this offering by Cain is rejected and the offering of Abel is accepted? Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof, and the Lord had respect unto Abel. Literally, God looked at it, he accepted it. But unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect, and then Cain becomes very angry about that. On the surface, you might think that each one brings an offering that is related to his vocation. After all, Abel was a shepherd and Cain was a farmer. On that ground, the offering of them both would have been acceptable for God. But the narrative does give an explanation. What does God say to Cain? If you do well, if thou doest well, shall it not be lifted up? That is your face. If you do well, will you not be accepted? Will you not be acceptable, is the idea. And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. So the offering of Cain, in some sense, does not take away, is not a sign of his consciousness of the possibility of evil. Here he is commanded to rule over the temptation of sin. Sin is at the door. So lauert die Sünde vor der Tür. It's at the door. So when you take a step across the door, across the line, the threshold of the door, then immediately you are caught within the power of sin. That's what will happen. Why are you so close to the door, Cain? Why are you tempted to think about something that you should not do? You know you should not do it, but you're thinking about it. You're very close to it. But let's first talk about these offerings and then about the first murder. There is something like a spiritual lack in Cain. He wasn't doing well. And that is why God says, if you do well, then your face will be lifted up. Sin was couching at Cain's door, which implies that he was not doing well. He was too close to the temptation of sin to be safe for it. Sin had the desire to devour Cain like a ravenous beast. God would lead Cain to recognize this foe and enter into combat with it. And God is the one who explains to Cain that he should change his ways, he should act good, which in this context means he should take care of his brother and his father and mother, and maybe his sisters. He should do well. And if he doesn't do well, if he's only concerned with his own desires, with his own well-being, that would lead him close to sinning. If you do not do the positive commandments, you will be tempted to break the negative commandments, the prohibitions. And God is explaining that to him. He is explaining that sin is a temptress, is something that pulls you away. Now, if you do well, you do not experience this temptation of sin. But if you don't do well, if you don't do what is required of you, actually, then you become vulnerable to the power of sin. By implication, God accepted Abel's offering for no other reason than this one, and that is that Abel was doing well. He was recognizing, obviously, sin as an enemy, and he was mastering it. If this is said about Cain, then and Cain's offering is not acceptable, then we can deduce from that Abel's offering was acceptable because of the spiritual attitude that Abel had in bringing that offering. He must have been the opposite of Cain. So he was doing good, and he was not close to the threshold of the door. Sin was not tempting him because he was very positive in his attitude to everyone else. That's why the Lord has respect unto Abel and to his offering. Now, there is an explanation in the New Testament about this entire passage that we might take into account as well. It's in the letter of Hebrews and then chapter 11. So take a look at this. I don't know why we only have this translation now, but this doesn't really matter. Let's get to the parallel. Something is missing here. Oh yeah, the JPS and the Hebrew Old Testament, obviously they are translations only of the Old Testament. So let's put the KJV beside it. Verse 4. By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. So the author of the book of Hebrews identifies faith as the difference between the two, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous. So faith led him to give a more excellent sacrifice, and that sacrifice actually signified that he was righteous. God testifying of his gifts, God himself gave testimony to his gift by accepting his sacrifice. Okay, this gave another reason for the rejection of Cain's offering and the acceptance of Abel's. It turns on the word acceptable. Acceptable means more excellent, superior, richer, greater, better. It's a qualitative superiority of Abel's offering over that of Cain's. Now, what is the nature of this superiority? Why is the sacrifice of Abel superior to that of Cain? Well, first of all, Abel's superior sacrifice was an act of faith, which implies that the sacrifice of Cain was not by faith. Now, the meaning of Abel's faith must be gained from the use of the word faith in the context of Hebrews 11. The author of Hebrews defines faith as the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. KJV JV is very literal here. It's indeed the substance of things, but it's better to translate this as the assurance. Evidently, Abel entertained the hope of God's fulfilling some kind of promise. That is what faith is all about in the book of Hebrews. It's the assurance of something that you don't see yet, but will come. That hope was based on his faith and trust in God. Now, we don't know the content of Abel's hope from Genesis 4. But doesn't it stand to reason that it has to do with the lessons that he learned what is happening here? Yeah, that the lessons that he learned from his father and his mother. It's conceivable that when Abel learned of the sacrifice that God himself made, that he had to make in order to fashion clothes for Adam and Eve, that he understood that a bloody sacrifice was necessary to cover his sins. By this offering, he would be showing his faith in God with respect to the hope that was connected to God's promise to his parents. This promise, actually, in Genesis 3, verse 15. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. By the way, these are the lines of the generations of Seth and Cain, and the seed of the woman is this line of generations. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. That is, let's say, what happens between these generations. I believe that the seed of the snake, that is the line of Cain, and the seed of the woman is the line of Seth. And they will be at odds with one another. And certainly, the head of the snake is supposed to be destroyed ultimately, but the snake is able to touch the line of Seth in the heel. That is the promise that Cain probably remembered, and that Abel probably remembered, and Cain refused to recognize any kind of guilt of sin. So he had no confidence at all in the promise. He had no confidence that this struggle, this war, was something that was both necessary and beneficial to enter into. In his mind, all that was necessary was sacrifice as an act of gratitude. But gratitude is not the point. He said, "Thank you, Lord, for what the Lord had given him, this harvest, this bountiful harvest," but he did not consider their status before God. Abel, on the other hand, realized his sin and recognized God's provision for the covering of sin, and Cain had no regard for this provision. If this interpretation is correct, the difficult problem of determining the origin of bloody sacrifices in biblical history also has a solution. So Cain's murder of his brother, we need to take a little look at that. And as I told some of you in classes that I gave to you, very important to look at the anatomy of murder that you have here. So this is the warning that God gives to Cain. If you do well, you will be accepted. Now, Cain obviously talked about this with Abel. There was a conversation, and my teacher in Amsterdam said, note that the word for talking here, vayomer, means that he told something. It's not vaidaber, which means he had a conversation. Could be anything. But vayomer means he told him something. Cain told something to Abel. Now, what else could he tell him than, let's say, what God told him? But this admonition that he gave, that he received from God, actually increased his anger about not being able to live fully independent, his anger that this weaker brother, Abel, with his name signifying dust and wind, Hevel, that he had to take care of him also. So the text says, and it came to pass, meaning it happened. This is what happened. There is no complete explanation for murder. Murder occurs when there is a whole lot of conditions fulfilled until there is this one unexplainable event that someone indeed pulls the trigger. If you do it 10 times, then you don't need to go through all these conditions and you don't feel ashamed afterwards. But this is the first murder. And Cain sees something overpowering him. He is so close to the threshold that this ravenous beast, this sin, can jump up and grab Cain, and now Cain is almost automatically doomed to kill his brother. It came to pass, it happened. This is the event. And I think Chet, that's the name for sin. Chet is the thing that brings Cain almost passively to commit this murder. When they were in the field with no one around, the field is the empty space no crops, no animals, that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. It suddenly happened. And it's a rising up. It's standing above Abel. Abel is weak. He is below him, and Cain rises up over him, towering over him, and then kills him, maybe with a rock or something else. That is the first anatomy of the murder. And then the rest is God's benign institution of the sign of Cain. He is cursing the ground. The ground has now is now filled with the blood of Abel. So he increases the hard work, the hard labor that is required to get a harvest from the soil. All of these are then result of all of this. But I wanted to keep this video as short as I could. So we talked about two things. We talked about the sacrifices of Cain and Abel. The sacrifices of Cain and Abel are different because, as the author of Hebrews explains, Abel's offering was based on faith. He respected and trusted the promise that God gave to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, verse 15. He recognized sin. He recognized the necessity of blood covering sin, and that is why he brought a bloody offering. He brought a sheep. So it was not about giving something that belongs to your trade, to your profession. That might be something like an act of thanks, but it was about recognizing their theological situation, so to speak. And note this: in order for Cain to give the proper offering, he had to ask Abel for a sheep. That's the only way he could get his hands on an animal, because they were under the care of Abel. And maybe, just maybe, because he didn't want to ask something of his brother, he brought instead an offering of fruit. Maybe Cain actually understood what was required of him, but he simply wouldn't accept it. Okay, that's it for now. Take care and see you next time.
Dank voor het luisteren naar Beit Ahavat Torah. Graag tot ziens.